Hello and welcome to Renovation Uncovered, a series of podcasts from Renovation Underwriting. Think of us as your renovation survival guide. My name's Daniel Fox, and in these episodes we'll journey through your property renovation from concept to completion. This time, it's timelines.
Well, there is no typical timeline. How long is a piece of string? Every project is different.
That is the voice of Lynn, my guest and guide in this episode. We'll look at some of the challenges that projects face.
It comes down to that classic triangle. You can have it done quickly, you can have it done well, you can have it done on budget. You can only pick two of those.
And Lynn has some sage advice too.
What you don't want to do is be in a position where you end up cutting corners to meet the deadline or to meet the budget.
This episode is called The Timeline of a Project. How long is this going to take? My first question to Lynn Toynton, Senior Underwriter at Renovation Underwriting, was about how long a typical project takes.
Okay, well, there is no typical timeline. How long is a piece of string? Every project is different, and the complexities will actually dictate how long things will take. But ultimately, you can normally follow a pretty simple rule. So you start out by talking to an architect. You have your idea that you want to do some work. You'll normally have to talk to someone to help them to map out how that's going to look and feel. That design process can take as short as a week. It could take as long as a couple of years, depending on how complex it is that you want to do. The other thing you need to do is then speak to a structural engineer, potentially, if you're going to be doing any kind of structural alterations, because you need to make sure that what they've designed will actually work in the real world. And then you also would need to speak to your contractor, who would then tell you how it works, and they would then be the ones that would map out roughly how long they think it's going to take to complete the works. There are some other parts of that project as well that you need to think about. You'll probably need to apply for planning permission, so then you need to involve the council, and if it's a listed property you need to involve heritage, etc. as well. The other part of it that people often forget is to take their professional advice for insurance and also legal advice, because ultimately you're entering into a contract, and sometimes for really significant amounts of money. That's your money that you want to make sure that is being properly protected. So there's lots of things that will build into that. There's quite a lot of complexity in the big projects, but even a small minor project where you're just thinking about doing a bit of internal remodeling or a loft conversion, for example, you still need to go through those same stages where you think about what's it going to look like, is it going to work, how long is it actually going to take, and then what else do I need to think about? So those stages will always be the same.
Being curious, I wanted to know the sorts of things that can influence a timeline. And without being negative, I wanted to know what can go wrong, which was met with this response.
That's quite a big question, because the answer is almost anything. Some things that can go wrong, if you like, is that people leave their insurance arrangements to the last minute, for example, and they phone up their broker on the day that the builders are about to start and say, right, just to let you know, builders are starting today, and then are shocked and surprised when they realise it's going to take a couple of weeks to actually sort out their cover, and potentially their current insurer won't cover them at all during that period. Other things that often take way longer than people anticipate is planning, and particularly planning on listed properties. Waiting for consent from somebody whose only job is to push around bits of paper can be excruciating. And from their point of view, there's no commercial incentive for them to get it done any quicker. So planning takes as long as it takes, and you just have to sit and take it.
As the eternal optimist, I hear what Lynn says, but I might not listen. After all, my job's not as big or as complicated or as difficult as anyone else's, and I always look on the bright side of life. So how do I set a realistic expectation to myself and my family?
That's quite a tricky one, because there's a lot of things that will make your expectations unrealistic. We hear it day in, day out, clients saying, my contractors told me this project is going to take somewhere between 6 and 12 months. I think it's going to be closer to 6. They will always say it's going to take less because I'm going to be on their case. I'm going to make sure that it gets done quicker. The fact of the matter is that usually when a contractor gives you a range of, say, 6 to 9 or 6 to 12 months, that 6 months is basically really unrealistic. It's in an ideal world with nothing ever going wrong and everything going absolutely perfectly and swimmingly, we could, with a fair wind and a bit of effort, get it done that quickly. But realistically, you've got to think about things like delays, even groundworks. You're digging a hole. If it's too cold, you can't break the ground. If it's too wet, guess what? You dig a hole and it just collapses in on itself. There's lots of other factors that you can't control. If you're putting a roof on, you can't put a roof on in wet weather. You can't build a wall when it's too cold because the mortar won't go off. So all these things that building professionals know, but an average person doesn't. So there's no point planning to do your big loft conversion in the middle of winter, for example, because it's going to take forever because you're going to be waiting for a clear day, which might happen once every couple of months. So those things can definitely affect it. Depending on how much planning permission you need will depend on how long it will take. Also, if you do any work to a party wall, that is a wall that is shared with a neighbour, for example, you also have to think about getting their consent. And they can create delays as well, because if they don't like the fact you're building right next to their boundary, you can suddenly find that you've got a lot more barriers being put in your place as a result.
This next bit is really key. If you're at an early stage in your plans, there are things that you can do to make it go smoothly, for things to be efficient, and also, importantly, to keep your expectations realistic.
So the most important thing you need to do is take advice. Don't just listen to your contractor. With the best will in the world, the contractor will always be optimistic because they want the project to run as smoothly as you, and they will be optimistic about the timescales. But talk to the architect, talk to other project professionals about similar projects that they've seen and how long they took. Ask your contractor and your architect questions. What sort of challenges can you foresee? Do we need to build in a contingency? We normally say to build in a contingency of about 20% in terms of time. So that's a good rule of thumb to go for. So if a contractor says that they think it's going to take 10 months, you should be thinking in your head it's probably going to take minimum 12. But you should be prepared in your mind for it to take as long as 18, just for the fact that if you have a problem with the supply chain, then that can cause a knock-on effect. Supply chain, actually, I've not even mentioned, but that's also quite an important factor. It's a bottleneck. There are certain parts of the supply chain where if you don't get one part of your building delivered and fitted, you cannot progress to the next stage of the build. So fitting windows is a classic example. You can't do any of your interior work, your decoration, until all your doors and windows are in and it's weather tight, because you can't decorate the inside of the windows. You can't put down flooring that's sensitive to weather. So if there is a delay with your windows being delivered of up to a month, it means that all of those tradespeople that have been booked in to do the work after the windows are fitted have all got to be cancelled and rebooked. And then, of course, what if they're not available? Then you've got to wait even longer because you've got to wait for their availability.
I'll be honest with you, the idea of delays hadn't been on my radar at all, but it happens all of the time. And so I'm interested to know how a contractor accounts for delays.
So there are some provisions that are made. It very much depends on the construct of how you've made your agreement with your contractor in the first place.
Aha, agreements again. You'll remember we talked about these in episode 1.
If you have taken legal advice and you've entered into a contract, some contracts will have a provision for overrunning. Most of them will allow a leeway, a contingency, because everybody knows that nothing goes to plan. But then outside of that, you would then have a provision in there, and it might be as simple as a financial penalty for the contractor for every week or month that they overrun past the anticipated date. It might be that they have a notice clause which says as soon as you're aware of something that's going to cause a delay, they have to give you notice, and if they don't, you can apply penalty, but if they do, you can then agree in a variation to the contract to push that timeline back, because you both agree that that delay is unforeseen. And there's some delays actually that are caused by the client as well. And that could be that the client has a change of mind halfway through. They might have suddenly decided that the doors that they've ordered, their internal doors, they might actually want to have handmade in Italy. And so if that's the case, they've introduced their own delays, or they might then suddenly say, actually, now you've built that room, I don't like its layout, you need to rip the walls down and rebuild it somewhere else, in which case, again, that's going to cause a delay. Those sort of variations have to be agreed between the client and the contractor. If you've got a good contract, you can then easily make those amendments. Some people don't have a contract at all, in which case it's all done ad hoc, and there's not really any kind of incentive or penalty for overrunning, which means that nobody really knows how long it's going to take until it's finished.
So we've talked about delays, and my next question was about common mistakes. What things do people frequently forget to do or overlook? And does this even happen?
Always. And it's no surprise to know that one of those things is insurance. We see it all the time. Last minute requests, people think that they can just phone up their insurers and say, I'm doing some works, that's okay, isn't it? And the answer almost always is, no, it's not okay. And then, depending on the complexity of the risk, if it's quite simple and straightforward from an underwriting perspective, somebody like us can come in and underwrite, turn around a quote request within a day and get them on cover. However, if it is complex, if there's any major structural work, for example, or it's a listed property, large sums insured that fall outside of our standard underwriting criteria, we might have to then refer that for additional capacity. And if that happens, you could be looking at delays of up to a week, 2 weeks before we can even get terms agreed.
Right. What does additional capacity mean? Well, in the context of renovation insurance, additional capacity typically refers to the availability of extra coverage or increased limits beyond the standard policy provisions. Now, this could include provisions for higher coverage limits, extended coverage periods, or additional coverage options tailored to a specific renovation project. Put simply, it provides flexibility and enhanced protection to address the unique needs and scope of renovation projects.
In those situations, if the client has got contractors all ready to go, they either have to make a decision of whether to continue the project without insurance, which is incredibly risky and pretty silly, or they have to tell their contractors to wait for 2 weeks. And then it might be the client that has to pay extra for the fact that their delay is caused by them.
If, like me, the idea of spending any more money on the project leaves you cold, it's best not to overlook the obvious. Get your renovation insurance organised in good time. So, as a broadcaster and a podcaster, the world of building and construction is completely foreign to me. And one of my biggest concerns going into a project, and something causing a bit of anxiety, is how I talk with builders. How do I communicate with them? After all, they know what they're doing, and I don't.
That's the thing, isn't it? Most private individuals are not project professionals. They don't do this on a daily basis. They might be doing their only ever build project that they ever do, or it might be that they've only done 1 or 2 before. So it's really good to have some good people around you that have done this kind of thing before. The architect's always a good place to start, or your designer. Sometimes you might get a consultant in, speak to your insurance broker, they've probably seen it before too. But the main thing that we would say is, first and foremost, make sure you get a contract in place that outlines your expectations. Not only how long you expect it to take, but also to outline your expectations in terms of delays, contingencies, and what penalties or not will happen if it overruns. The other important thing is to ask your contractor quite early on to just plot out for you roughly how long they expect each part of the project to take. So we often refer to a document called a Gantt chart. A Gantt chart is a document that's used by project managers, and it outlines key phases of the project, how long it's going to take, what depends on it and what it depends on, so that then if one part is delayed, you can see what knock-on effects that will have. But also you can use that as a bit of a sense check. For example, if they say they're going to be doing groundworks in the middle of December, you can just sit there and think, is that realistic? Do we really think they're going to be able to do that within this timescale? What if there's bad weather, for example? Or it might also denote how long the lead times will be for certain things. So for example, if you're ordering your windows, windows are quite a big topic at the moment, because what used to take 6 weeks to get windows manufactured and delivered is now taking between 3 and 6 months. So people in the industry should know that. So they should be marking in their project plan that 6 months before the windows are needed is when they need to think about ordering them, so that they're ready in time for when it's time to fit them. So that's the next important thing, is make sure that project is plotted out and ask your contractor for that. Now, on a big project, they will draw up a Gantt chart as a matter of course. It's part of their project management. For smaller projects or less experienced contractors, they probably won't. It'll all be done off the back of an envelope or out of their head. So just ask them to jot it down. It doesn't have to be a big formal document, just something with key timescales and when they expect it to be done by. That way, you've got an idea that if they say they're going to be at X stage by March and they're not there, then you already know at that point that you're running behind, and you can start to think about what you can do about that. Also, on large projects, you might have other professionals. You might have a quantity surveyor, for example, who comes in and just checks at various key points of the project. And it's always a good idea to schedule regular updates with your contractor. So every so often, just check in with them and say, are we where we expected to be? Don't give me the old flannel.
Old flannel, I believe, is a technical term.
I really want to know the truth. Are we still on time? Is it still realistic that we're going to finish at this date? And the sooner you get that information and the sooner you can find out if that end date's going to be pushed back, then the better equipped you are to make a decision about whether you want to continue the project as it is, or if you need to make amendments.
Coming back to expectations and timelines then, Lynn and I got talking about how Grand Designs reminds us almost every week that things quite often don't go the way we want.
Well, it's a great example, actually. Grand Designs is brilliant as a really good way to show people how no project ever goes to plan. I saw a Facebook meme the other day of somebody doing an impression of Grand Designs. And it basically was somebody saying, oh yes, I'm going to self-manage everything. I'm going to get everything handmade bespoke. It's going to take me 6 months and my budget is £35,000. And then they come back to them 5 years later and they say, well, I'm still going. Budget's now currently at 3.7 million and all my contractors have left and my wife's left me and I'm living in a caravan and my life's gone and I've been really ill. And it's always the same story because it goes wrong. And I really wish, what's funny is everybody watches or has seen Grand Designs at least once, but everybody sits there and thinks, idiot, it never happened to me. But it will happen. It does happen all the time.
So there you have it. I've told you, Lynn's told you, the lovely Kevin McLeod on the TV's told you, timescales do and will slip. And the other takeaway point so far is communication. It makes a massive difference.
The most important difference it makes is actually for yourself and your own satisfaction with how the project is progressing. The most frustrating thing for you as a client is the fact that you're spending your money and it's going into this big black hole and you don't know where it's going and you don't know how it's progressing. And especially, unfortunately, where you look at a project and you think, well, I thought we were going to be here by now, and you've already planned in your head that you're going to have moved in before the school year starts and it's all going to be lovely and pretty and you'll have your tree up for Christmas. And here it is in November and you're still looking at a big hole in the ground and you're thinking, well, I'm not in my house now. Talking to your contractor all the way through is a really good way to feel more in control.
By the way, the next episode of this series is all about being in control, so make sure you keep listening for that.
If you feel in control, then you feel much more comfortable with how things are progressing. Where relationships between clients and contractors often break down is that communication, because the contractor will know that's inevitable, this is going to get a delay. Obviously, we've got a problem with this and that's added time. Obviously, you've just told me to rip down that staircase and rebuild it. You've just added 2 months onto the build time. But if they haven't communicated that to the client is still in their head thinking that the project is going to finish on budget and on time, and it just won't. So that is the most important thing. Regular contact, regular updates, and ask those honest questions, because the contractor doesn't want to fall out with you either, but they will feel like they're under attack if the only time you ever talk to them is to say, why are you not where you said you were going to be? Because that doesn't help anyone.
Next, we talked about speed. Everyone wants everything yesterday. And if you're living in a house that's being renovated around you, your entire world is upside down. And if you're living elsewhere, you're probably accruing extra costs in rent or even just in extra fuel. So I'm curious to know how you strike a balance between speed and getting a nice result.
Well, it's the impossible triangle, isn't it? It comes down to that classic triangle. You can have it done quickly, you can have it done well, you can have it done on budget. You can only pick 2 of those. So at some point, compromises have to be made. First and foremost, if you're realistic in your expectations in the first place and you've built in that contingency, then you don't need to be standing there cracking the whip constantly, asking them to go faster and faster. But at the same time, you need to watch your budget, because if you are asking them to put more manpower into it, if you are asking them to source materials quickly, the only way to do that is to pay for it. So you have to have that balance. You have to think about these things, but you also have to be realistic and you have to know when to flex. And if the matter of fact is that they're not going to be able to finish on time, then you need to be able to accept that and then move on. What you don't want to do is be in a position where you end up cutting corners to meet the deadline or to meet the budget. If you cut corners, mistakes are made, things go wrong. People can be hurt, or you end up with a really poor quality of finish, which is going to cause more problems down the line. So be really conscious of that. It's not always about standing on top, breathing down your contractor's neck to make sure that they're finishing everything on time and squeezing every penny out of the budget, because if you do that, you're going to end up in a really poor position with your relationship. Having said that, the other thing you can do, of course, is if you are really running out of time or you're running out of money, you can always stop and rethink your design. You don't have to have everything perfect straight away if you're desperate to get into the house at a particular point. You can always go for a quicker or cheaper finish. And one of the things you can always do, of course, is choose something that's easily upgradable at a later date. So if you're going to focus your time, effort and money, focus it on the things that you can't change easily later. But if it's something you can change later, then if you need to get it done and finished, that's what you do, rather than putting pressure on your contractor to try and throw more and more and more man hours, so they end up having somebody who's just worked a 12-hour shift falling off a ladder and having an accident. You don't want that on your conscience.
Lynn Toynton of Renovation Underwriting, wrapping up this episode of Renovation Uncovered. Lynn is back with me on the next episode as we talk about why it's good to be a control freak.
We all want to be control freaks. The biggest thing for me is that, as I said all along, it's your money, it's your asset, it's your biggest financial investment, potentially of your lifetime. And when you're looking at protecting that, you need to make sure that you're going into it with your eyes wide open.
Catch you next time.